Nook. I am Lexi. I am your host. This is my podcast all about books, book club recommendations, Reese Witherspoon book club picks, and then if you like reading as much as I do, a little bit of everything. So if you are a longtime listener or about 4 months of a listener, then you kind of know the drill. I have 2 episodes per month. The first episode will be a review of all the books that I will be reading for that month, and just like a little show and tell of the books, just like a general intro. And then the second episode is at the end of the month after I've read those books, review them, and then I'll have some discussion questions. So these books are open on my website on lexisbooknook.com if you want to use any of these books mentioned for your own book club, or if you want to start your own. So this is like a little starter podcast for you. So it's the end of April. I'm going to go over all the books real quick of what all those books are, and then I'm going to do a little summary, my thoughts on them, and then a few discussion questions. But this is not just available on Spotify. This is free on Spotify. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to have additional benefits of seeing my face, the book titles, my book nook, and get inspiration for your own, I do have a Patreon account that's $3 per month. And that's just to get all those benefits I just mentioned. I also have a BookTube channel. It's a YouTube channel all about books, so you can see my face there as well. However, you get additional bonuses on YouTube. You get to see bonus content, bonus episodes of books that are beyond the list of books that I read for my podcast. So it's a little bit extra books for my TBR. And if you like a little bit of everything, if you like some thrillers, some romance, fantasy, historical fiction, those are some of my favorite genres. And I'll also go over some of my favorite authors. One of them, which we will be discussing today, is Chris Bohjalian. So we're going to do one Chris Bohjalian book for April, and let's get into it for the rest of the month. So I am part of 2 book clubs. One of them is here in Cockeysville, Maryland. The second one is back at home, Books on Tap. So it's a book club that we all get together once a month at our local bar, and we can talk about books while we drink. And then I have a couple of books that I'm trying to stay on theme for each month. So for April, I have like a kind of not so funny book. I have like a nature-esque book. I also will read and review books that have been adapted into TV series or movies. That's one of my favorites. I have one of them. And then I also do a Reese Witherspoon pick of the month. And then books on my TBR list. So let's get into it. So the first one is the Cockeysville Book Club book. And if you're on BookTube and Patreon, you can see the picture of it. This is the Daughter of Dr. Moreau. That's the first book. The next one is The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy. This is the Books on Tap pick. The next one is going to be a Reese Witherspoon pick. I do not have the physical copy, but it is going to be Daisy Jones and the Six. So if you guys are also watching that TV series, let me know how it is on my website. You can always message me. I have not started watching it yet. I'm very behind on TV, but I love the book and audiobook, and we're going to get into that. But the next book 2 TV series adaptation is going to be Saint X by Alexis Shakin. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. It's a pretty cool book. So we have that. I mentioned Daisy Jones and the Six. That's the Reese Witherspoon pick. I don't have that on me. The next one, and I listened to this on an audiobook, and it is a little long, is The Overstory by Richard Powers. This is my nature-esque book for the month. We'll get into that. The next one, I was trying to go into something kind of funny and lighthearted because of April Fool's Day. But the book I got was kind of like a dry humor, dark humor, talks about mental health, but it's kind of a funny story by Ned Vizzini. And here's the cover. So it has some dark humor and not so ha-ha funny, but a little different. And then the last book of the month is Midwives by Chris Bohjalian. So I mentioned that he's one of my favorite authors. So we are going to try to get into Chris Bohjalian, Liam Moriarty, and some other authors, hopefully, that we can get through by the end of the year. If not, there's always another book. So there's always another month, and we can get into that some other time. But we're going to go into these books. So we're going to start with the summary and my thoughts and discussion questions. And we're going to start off with The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. here's the cover one more time before we get started. I'm going to put it away. So, The Daughter of Dr. Moreau is a historical drama that takes place during the 19th century in Mexico. The story focuses on the young adult Carlotta Moreau, who is the daughter of scientist Dr. Moreau and Montgomery Lawton. Not the daughter of Montgomery, but Montgomery is an outcast who assists the doctor with his experiments, and these experiments are financed by the Lizaldes. The doctor has made scientific achievements that can change the world with the creation of this hybrid species of part human, part animal. Everyone lives in a perfectly balanced and static world until the abrupt arrival of Eduardo Lizalde, the charming son of Dr. Moreau's patron. So I'm going to go into my thoughts, and then we're going to go into the discussion questions. I'm only going to do 3 of them, just for the sake of time. And if you're really intrigued by these questions and you want to read and find out more, go and get the book on my website, lexisbooknook.com. But I'm just going to go into my thoughts in 3 questions. So this is, like I said, the Cockeysville Public Library's book club pick for the month that we all kind of pick and vote on. But this has been one of my favorite books of this month so far. And also the whole year so far. It's only been 4 months. There's always more time. But it's written by the author of Mexican Gothic, which is another one of my favorites, which is a young adult kind of like drama horror book. This one was not so much horror, but it was Gothic and sci-fi, and I don't usually like science fiction books, but this one was really good. I also thought this book was interesting because it talked about Mexican history and with some Gothic touches, and the Gothic touches are with the hybrids, pretty much. But I didn't know at first if I would like how this book was going because the perspectives were going back and forth with first Carlotta's and then Montgomery's perspectives, because it seemed like there is just a retelling of what just happened, just through different perspectives. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to take forever. But eventually the characters split up on their own adventures, their own paths from each other, but they're still telling like the same story, just at different time, like the same time, different areas of like the island that they lived on. And that is when it got interesting because it made me crave to know what was happening to the other person at the same time. And I mentioned that this book is Gothic, but it's not scary. So don't think that it's horror, because it's not. But like I said, it's one of my favorite books. I give it 5 out of 5 stars. And I'm going to go into some discussion questions from my library's book club. I have my whole script right here. So the first one is, Carlotta has grown up in isolation on her father's estate. How do you think this has shaped who she is and the choices she makes? So I think it has forced her to be more independent and more mature for her age, because she has been around her father, who was a scientist, and his experiments, so she's very aware of certain things around the island. But she was also very isolated because she didn't know anybody her age or any other girls around her age. So she was always kind of alone, and other than being with her father. So her father made all the decisions for her. So she was very trapped in a gilded cage, kind of. And this made her to act out eventually by choosing Eduardo to be her husband rather than someone else. Like, her father wanted her to find someone worthy to marry, but more so in the sake of financial stability in case Dr. Moreau's experiments did not go well. He wanted to find someone who would be able to take care of his daughter. And Eduardo was not his first choice, but she chose him. So I think because she was isolated for so long, she kind of acted out and did her own thing. She beat to the sound of her own drum. The next question. What did you think about Carlotta's relationship with the hybrids? How does her attitude towards them differ from her father's, from Lizalde's? How do you think you would react to the hybrids? So her relationship with the hybrids is that she saw them as her family. She didn't see them as part animal, part human, or animal at all. She treated them like any other individual. So she was very loving. She wanted to build a village with all of her, like her relatives, and I say that in air quotations, and all her friends and her siblings. She wanted to create a community out of them, which is very different from like her father, because he saw them as experiments, a way to really play with science and hopefully make some money off of them, but more so on the scientific end of the things, because Lizalde was more so wanting these hybrids for money's sake. And how do I think I would react to the hybrids? I think, well, as a human, I think I'm going to see them as a hybrid. I'm going to see them as something different. I'm going to see them as something that you have to be sensitive about, because you don't want to offend them by saying, oh, you're such a pig, and because they are half pig, because they might find offense to that because they're also part human. So I don't know. I think that's my perspective out of it. But if I were like a hybrid like them, I'm sure I'm going to have a different perspective, maybe something similar to Carlotta's. But it really just depends if who I am in that story. If I'm a human, I'm going to think one way. If I'm a hybrid, I'm going to see them as an equal, or who knows? Maybe I think myself inferior to them, or hopefully not. I think that I'm superior to these hybrids because I'm a better hybrid. Like Carlotta was more feminine. She was more humanistic. She could have felt more superior to them, but she didn't. So I think it really just depends on where I'm placed in the story. And the last question I want to go over is, what is your reaction to Dr. Moreau's experiments? Do you think there are any circumstances under which genetic experimentation is ethical? Why or why not? So I kind of already reacted a little bit on these experiments, but I also thought a little bit deeper, and I thought that creating these experiments is actually kind of sad, because I saw it as a deeper meaning than just experiments like these hybrids. I interpreted them as Dr. Moreau's loneliness, because he's so isolated, and he wanted to create something that will keep him feeling like he has a family and included and not so alone, and he had some company, even if they weren't of the same species as him. So he created these hybrids. And I think I said that he did it out of loneliness and then expanded and kept experimenting out of curiosity. But I don't think that this makes it right. I don't think this makes it ethical. I think these creatures were made knowing that they had short lifespans and medical conditions, because that was mentioned in the book. And despite knowing that, Dr. Moreau kept making more and more and more, and it makes life harder for these hybrids because they have so many conditions or diseases, or they're accident prone, or they're very fragile, or they could die in 12 years or 5 years or whatever. So it seems kind of cruel to make these experiments knowing that they're going to die right away, and that it's not what the hybrids signed up for. It just seemed kind of cruel. Not quite like animal testing. I think this is a little bit different than that, but I don't think it's ethical. But those are all the questions I have for the Daughter of Dr. Moreau. If you want to look at the cover one more time, here it is. Now, like I said, I have a website called lexi'sbooknook.com where you can buy your own copy for your own book club, or if you want to start your own and you want to start with the Daughter of Dr. Moreau. And this is by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Lexi's Book Nook, Lexies, booknook.com to buy your own copy. And we're going to the next one. We're going to go into The Passenger. And here we go. Here is the cover for it. Now, I actually listened to this as an audiobook. I'm going to get into that. So here's the summary for The Passenger. It starts out in the year 1980 with our protagonist, Bobby Western, who is a professional diver. Bobby has been assigned to a task to dive into an airplane crash site with his companion. On diving, they find 9 dead bodies buckled into the seats and the jet case and data box missing. Who took it and how? What will be revealed is that there is another passenger in the aircraft who was missing. How did the passenger go missing from the sunken aircraft? Is he or she a dead or alive? Did this person steal the missing items? There's a lot of questions here, but this book has its readers face uncomfortable facts about life and what lies underneath it, reality, history, and other truths about the world. And you know what? I didn't get a single one of those. I listened to the audiobook and I felt it kind of dry. I didn't find it very personable. I didn't find I could really connect to any characters. I didn't know what was going on at first with the diving. I thought that would be really cool. I thought that was going to be the bulk of the story, and I thought it was going to be more like a mystery. But it really wasn't. It was more boring than I thought it would be. And like I said, I thought it was going to be more of a mystery, but I couldn't get engaged with it. And it felt like there was more fluff than material to build on the story. But they also went over the narration of Bobby's sister, Alicia. We go into her perspective knowing that she's dead, and I prefer this narration. And that's kind of sad because she's not even really in the story. We learn that she died before the book started. She died by committing suicide. When she was alive, she lived with schizophrenia. Alicia and Bobby had a close relationship, and despite their closeness, Alicia was unable to maintain mental stability and checked herself into the Stella Maris mental hospital. While there, she formed relationships and started hallucinating. Her hallucinations were only like comic relief, really, and made the book/audiobook, because I listened to it, more bearable for me. It made it seem funnier and more lighthearted. But if this was not a book club recommendation, I don't think I would have listened to this. I give this 2 out of 5, maybe. Check out my website and my blog. I might have rated it something a little different. But 3 questions. What is the message of the passenger? And I think I kind of mentioned that in the summary. Like, there are a few messages, some of them being morality and science, the legacy of sin, and the madness that is human consciousness. And I think the morality and science is part on Bobby's perspective with the diving and the mystery and all that. And legacy of sin, I didn't really get that as much, but I think that's Bobby and Alicia's relationship. Yeah, there was like a rumor that they had some romance, like incest, not incense. So there's the sin, but they don't really go into that too much. It's just a rumor. And then the madness that is human consciousness is part of Alicia, her perspective, and the schizophrenia and the suicide. That's also a sin. Okay, but let's go into the second book. I couldn't find many questions for The Passenger, so I got this one. Is The Passenger a standalone book? And I chose it because there is another book that has the same characters, but different stories, but it can be a standalone book. It's the only one I've read by Cormac McCarthy, but it can be read either before or after the other book, Stella Maris. They're both fiction, and they take place in the same universe with the same characters, but a different story, like I mentioned. But it can be a standalone. And the last one, I like this question because I came up with it. What do Alicia's psyche tell us about her? Well, she has multiple psyches. And I think her psyches are technically her hallucinations after discontinuing her medications. They always come back to her when she comes home from whatever adventure she finished for the day. And I think it's a way for her to shut off her brain and come back to reality, and where her guard is down and she's forced to really think and reflect and be at her most vulnerable. So these psyches come to her in that sense, and that's how it should be, but she couldn't really tolerate it. But in a way, I think her psyche brings a sense of logical thinking as well. Her psyche named the kid, or like the kid, I don't know which one it is. I need to say that with air quotations. He always asks questions about her future, education, and potential. And although Alicia doesn't want to answer these questions or want to live a normal life, she doesn't really have a direction. The kid is always there to try to keep her on track to a more fulfilling adventure, and I think this is Alicia's inner sense of herself. Like, she knows that there's so much more for her out there, but she's afraid to tackle these questions. And we see that in these encounters, Alicia has no interest, and that's her depression. She has these thoughts. She's thinking about her future and her education and what she wants to do, but she's pushing them off because that's what depression does. It makes you shut off from the world. It makes you give up. It makes you have a lack of interest or energy for these things. But the psyche, the kid, is there as a part of her. But if you like that kind of stuff, that's The Passenger for you. I didn't like it. I listened to it as an audiobook. Maybe it's different when you're reading it. But if you want this for your book club, again, this is on Lexi's Book Nook, and you can buy your copy there. So here's the cover before I put it away, and then we're going to go into True Biz, not Daisy Jones and the Six. I lied. I'm so sorry. But I don't have the picture for this or a book, but it is very easy to find in any library, and you can also buy it in any bookstore. But we're going to go into True Biz. And fun fact, True Biz is ASL slang for real talk. So let's talk. This novel is told from a two-character perspective. Most of the narrative is told from the River Valley School for the Deaf Headmistress, February. Another character's perspective is of Charlie, the new student at school. River Valley School for Deaf Students is the last resort for students who have been neglected or their needs are misunderstood by their parents. The school is on shaky ground, constantly at risk of closure due to financial reasons. And I like this book. I thought it was very interesting and eye-opening on deaf culture. The most common theme of this book that I found is that there is a broad spectrum of hearing impaired individuals. The novel explored how these individuals adapt to their cultures, both deaf and non-hearing impaired cultures. And this is kind of like me babbling on during my thoughts, but and just getting like some background on it, but I'm going to keep going. In the past, it has been implied that deaf individuals are deaf and dumb, which leaves some stigmatism. However, deaf people aren't necessarily intellectually impaired. This is another theme in which individuals may struggle in learning institutions due to adapting to non-hearing impaired education, behavioral issues, and the development of advanced technological implants. By using these implants, some individuals may never learn how to use sign language, but that doesn't mean that they are dumb. And that's where the stigmatism comes in with deaf students who know how to speak in ASL, and they see their peers who do not know ASL. Overall, I learned a lot about deaf culture while also delving into a fictional world and getting attached to characters and their development. So these are very intellectual questions, and I have a little bit lengthy answers, so bear with me. The first question is, if you're part of the hearing community, how much did you know about deaf community and culture prior to reading this novel? What are some key aspects that you learned? And I kind of already mentioned this in my thoughts when I was babbling. I knew very little about deaf culture prior to reading this book. My college did offer an ASL minor, but I did not go after it. And I knew that deaf people communicate through ASL and lip reading, but nothing about the stigmatism surrounding them and the controversy topic of cochlear implants. I knew nothing about it going into it. But I learned that if individuals get these implants, they might not learn ASL, which may hinder their education and or adaptation into the hearing community. The implants are relatively new and may have some underlying issues. If they were to malfunction, then the deaf individual may not be able to communicate if they're reliant on the implant and not on ASL. And then there are deaf families who may look down on those who use implants because they're relying on technology and not bothering to learn how to truly adapt to the deaf culture. Excuse me for just a moment. So I learned a lot not really knowing anything about the deaf community and culture. So going into the second question, what are some of the key themes you picked up on? Did you highlight any sections of the novel, such as quotes or certain events? And I know and see a lot of people on Bookstagram who annotate things in their books. I don't do that. I'm afraid of writing in books. I don't want to damage them. And I don't like the look of sticky notes in books. It gets me very overwhelmed. So I didn't do anything of that, but I did mention some of the themes in my little babble of my thoughts. And I mentioned those two themes. One of them is that there's a broad spectrum of hearing impaired individuals. There's not just one type. There are different types of hearing loss. One is conductive hearing loss, and I did research on these, which means that vibrations aren't passed to the outer ear to the inner ear, specifically the cochlea. And the second type is sensorineural hearing loss, which is caused by dysfunction. And then there's also another type of hearing loss called mixed hearing. For types 2 and 3 that I mentioned, cochlear implants may be needed. So that's the first theme, a very broad spectrum of hearing impaired individuals. So there's not just one type. You can't just narrow it down to, such and such has such and such hearing loss. And we can't be bothered. But no, you don't know that. It doesn't hurt to ask people. And the second theme is that deaf individuals are dumb. or that's more like a myth, really. This may mean that they cannot communicate or that they are figuratively dumb, but that's not true. Deaf individuals can communicate using ASL, which stands for American Sign Language. Although they cannot clearly orally communicate, they have ASL that they can utilize. By using these implants and ASL, deaf individuals can better adapt to their learning environment and succeed in their endeavors. So it's a combination of the two that can help. So those are the two themes. One is the broad spectrum of hearing impaired individuals, and two, which is more like a myth, that deaf individuals are dumb. So don't assume anything with deaf individuals. And I think that goes with any disability. And we're going to go into the last question, which is, why do you think ASL is not taught more in schools? Do you know ASL or have an interest in learning the language? So I mentioned my school. I went to McDaniel College, like I said, and they taught it. I didn't even learn like a basic class. And I think it's because ASL is not prevalent nowadays. It's just not very common anymore, and I think there's insufficient ASL classes hiring full-time workers. Maybe there's a lack of qualified instructors who are able to teach it. Maybe there's enough demand for ASL classes. But I don't know. You don't see it nowadays. But I do think some of the hearing community should learn how to communicate with deaf individuals, deaf peers, whether it's lip reading, learning how to lip read, or learning how to do ASL, because I think it could be a very necessary skill one day. Who knows? But yeah, I think it's going to be very helpful. And I think especially in younger classes, such as in elementary school, if it's going to be prevalent, it's going to mostly happen when the kids are young, when they're deaf. And if they learn how to do ASL younger, it's going to stick with them then. And I think even if they're not hearing impaired, they should still learn ASL. That way they know how to communicate. They've learned another skill set. They're learning a different language. It's going to broaden their horizons. I think it's going to be very helpful. And again, I think it's going to be better for them to communicate with their peers, whether they're hearing or not hearing. And that's really it for that question. So it's really about, what are your thoughts on ASL culture and community, what I learned and the themes, and about ASL as a language itself. I don't have that cover for you because I read that actually last year. So that's the Reese Witherspoon pick, True Biz. We're going to go into the next book. We're going to go into Saint X. So here is the cover again. And I actually listened to this. If you have been listening, I've really been getting on a thriller binge. So this is my thriller pick for this month. And here is the summary. The story is about Allison Thomas, a beautiful, witty, and privileged 18-year-old girl who disappears on the last day of her family's vacation on the Caribbean island of Saint X. That is a long sentence. I apologize. She eventually is found dead in a remote spot in a nearby cay. Claire, her 7-year-old sister, is now an only child. The two native islanders, employees at the resort, are accused of Allison's murder. The story turns national news into a lurid mystery that will go unsolved. Thus, Claire persistently shadows Clive, one of the men originally suspected for murdering Allison. Claire hopes to gain his trust, waiting for the slip that will reveal the truth, but an unlikely attachment develops between the two. And my thoughts. So, if you're one of my readers, regular ones, you know that I like my thrillers. So this, like I said, this was my thriller pick for the month. But it's also a book that's being adapted into a TV series. So I think this would be a really cool adaptation to see how this plays out. But it's a murder mystery, like I said. So I think it's kind of like Clue, kind of like Murder on the Orient Express a little bit. And this will actually be released on Wednesday, April 26th. But this episode is going to will come out after that. So by the time you finish listening to this, go watch it. Let me know how it is. I'm actually recording this on April 24th because I'm getting ready for a big trip, so I will not be watching it. But I don't typically like murder mysteries because I'm impatient and want answers right away, but this was a good one. I was actually more engaged in this audiobook than the other audiobooks that of this month's picks. So I can, like I said, I can see this being adapted for the TV. I think it'll be really good. But I think I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. So what does the island setting contribute to the story? What about the juxtaposition of New York City? Big word. So I think the island of St. X was chosen because it is not often talked about. It's remote and picturesque. It's described as a tropical paradise meant for vacation and very little of anything else. So you wouldn't really associate it with murders, but not until Alice and Thomas. It's the best place to get lost and probably a good place to disappear. Whereas New York City is the complete opposite. The island natives probably want to escape to from the very small town life and dream of going somewhere grandiose and big. I'm sorry, I can't speak well, but that's how I normally am. These employees, they want to be somebodies, they want to be successful and rich and make a mark in the world. So they think that is New York City, and they probably want to escape from their guilt about Allison's death as well. So that's why they want to get in New York City, to get lost and not become smaller in the world. Second question, what does Claire's name change to Emily signify to you? And I think Claire changed her name after Allison's disappearance and death, probably to escape the headlines as a family who lost their daughter and sister. She wanted to get away from the limelight and constant questions about her vacation. Like the native men, she wanted to escape her familial trauma. She probably also had some identity crisis as well. Like, this is kind of young, and that's more common nowadays anyway. And she wanted to not be known as the sister of the girl who died. So she decided to change her name to create a new identity in life without Allison in it. The last question, Emily's role in New York becomes very small after she encounters Clive. Do you think that was intentional or unintentional on her part? What might have motivated her to turn inward? And yes, I think she was intending to find Clive. I think she was trying to find him to get more details on her sister's murder. But she also wanted to make her life a little bit smaller, less well-known, not as popular as being the sister of the dead girl. So she focused all her attention on Clive to discover the truth about her sister's death. And the point she turned inward was when she noted the date she was officially older than Allison post-death. She started to reflect on her identity more and wanted answers more and more. She discovered Allison's collection of video/voice diaries and started to listen to them. And it may seem like an invasion of privacy, but it was Claire's only chance to truly understand her sister and to discover how she could have disappeared that night in St. X. And it may have been the beginning of her wanting to connect with Clive to find more answers. But that is St. X for you, excuse me. So here's the cover one more time. And this will be out on Hulu, I believe, on Wednesday, April 26th. So start watching it and let me know. The next book is my Mother Earth Natureist Earth Day book called The Overstory by Richard Powers. Here's the cover, and we're going to go into that. So The Overstory is a novel about the impassioned work of activism of the natural world. The story includes 9 character narratives on their activism and struggles to make their protests heard by society. And it just goes over all the different characters, and I don't want to read all of this because it will just bore you, but there is the whole family, Mimi, Adam Apich, Ray Brinkman, and Dorothy Cazaly, Douglas, Dougie Pavlik, Neeley, Patricia, Olivia, so many people, how they get involved in this activism for basically saving trees. But if that doesn't sound like the story for you, don't worry about it, because I thought this book was kind of dry. And it was kind of hard to keep up with all of their stories. As soon as I got accustomed and attached to one character, or I got accustomed to the story that was being told, they changed the narrative all over again. And I had to remember, oh my gosh, what happened to Mimi, or what happened to Adam? Like, I forgot as soon as we got to the next character, and there's so many characters, it's just hard to keep up with. But they're all very passionate and intelligent. I felt inspired listening to all their stories, but I just thought it was too dry. I thought there were too many characters. I thought it was a little lengthy at times. I wish there was less than 9 characters that I had to focus on. But because of that, I felt myself lose interest in the story, and I would tune out. I think it would be a cool mockumentary type, and I think it will be. I think it's going to be a documentary on Netflix. So we got Earth Day and a TV adaptation. So we got a twofer. So I think this would be a little interesting to watch if you are into nature documentaries. So that is always there for you guys. We'll get into the questions. Why do you think Richard Powers chose the title The Overstory? And I actually had to look it up a little bit so I knew the definition going into this answer. And it means the layer of foliage in a forest canopy, or the highest layer of vegetation in a forest. And this book is definitely about the preservation of trees and nature as a whole. So that was a perfect title for it. But there are also layers of other people's stories in the collection of this book. So I think he chose Overstory to emphasize the ecosystem that surrounds the book and the story, but also to emphasize the layers of people's stories throughout the book and how they overlap with each other. The next question, Patricia describes trees and humans as being at war over land and water in the atmosphere, and that she can see which side will lose by winning. What does she mean by that? If humans were to win the war, then trees would start to diminish, right? Humans would industrialize the world even more by cutting down more and more trees and building other companies and buildings and modernize the world. Thus, the trees would lose. We lose trees. But if the trees were to win, then there would be so much vegetation that humans can easily get lost. We won't be able to survive. We won't be able to function as like the normal human beings that we think we are. And as a race, we'll have to learn how to survive in the wilderness. So it'll be like survival of the fittest. So I think that's what she meant. Like, it can either be humans or trees. It can never be both. There's never a balance. And then the last question, the book is divided into 4 parts: roots, trunk, crown, and seeds. What is the significance of each section? Were you surprised when the stories began to intertwine? And I was not surprised, but I liked how the book was divided into 4 parts. The significance of each section are like different parts of the tree's anatomy, but they also describe the collection of stories. So like, what are the roots or origin of each character in the roots section? The trunk is the character development. The crown would be how the characters grow, like how the branches grow out, really. And then how did they branch out in the world? And then the seeds part is how can their work spread to future generations. So I think it was very signifying. I think Richard did this on purpose, and I liked how he did. I liked how he divided each of the sections, not just as parts of the tree, but how the people's stories began, grew, and ended throughout the book. But I wasn't surprised that he did this. I think it was very smart on his part. But there's so much more to it. Like I said, I was not a fan of it. I listened to it. It got dry. I tuned out. I think I gave this like a 2 or 3 on my blog, so you can check it out on Lexi's Book Nook. But here is the cover again. And I think it would be a good book to discuss about. It's just not my speed. So we're going to go into the next book. It's kind of a funny story, and I have my notes on my phone actually for this one. But here is the cover for it. It's a very easy read. The book that I got, the copy, has large print. I don't know if you can see that on Patreon and YouTube. But there it is. So this is a dark humor story made very inspiring and informative about mental health. This novel is about Craig Gilner. He is a 15-year-old teenager who struggles with depression. Craig is a high school student who is facing academic and social pressures. He gradually has increasing cyclical, depressive, and suicidal thoughts. One evening, he plans to take his life, but instead he calls a suicide hotline and is admitted to a psychiatric hospital. He spends 5 days at the hospital where he learns more about himself, his condition, and how he learns to interact with people in the ward, not in the world, but eventually it will help him in the world. But like I said, I thought this would be a fun book for April Fool's Day, but man, was I wrong. It was like really dark. But I was the one that was fooled. But I did like this book. it was not what I expected. Instead, like I said, it's a teenager with depression, but who doesn't have depression at that age? And I felt really bad for Craig because it's all the pressures of being successful in this very prestigious school, and the pressure just got to him. So I wasn't very surprised how he ended up. He's very relatable and easy to like. The book was funny in some places, though, especially with certain characters, but it's also dark. Like I said, easy read. I really liked it. I couldn't put it down. I didn't want to put it down. I give this a 5 out of 5. I know, surprising, right? So the questions. Craig likes to make drawings of people and objects with maps for brains, and that's seen on this title. What do these brains represent? And taken from the book, this is a quote. If roads were twisted neurons, pulling emotions from one place to another, bringing the city to life. A working brain is probably a lot like a map where anybody can get from one place to another on the freeways. It's the non-working brains that get blocked and have dead ends. And I think that speaks volumes. I think that is very, very true. And I think Craig took this from experience and he used it as an outlet in his drawings. So I came up with that question because there wasn't any book club questions for this. So if you read this book, take these questions, write them down. I did make these up on my own. So why does Craig feel like he can connect with people at 6 North, the psychiatric ward, that he barely knows instead of his own classmates or friends? And I think it's because Craig has more in common with the people at 6 North. What they all have in common is that they all struggle with emotional problems. At 6 North, Craig is exposed to individuals with significant problems of their own, some worse than his. He meets Bobby and Johnny, former drug abusers, Humble, a man with aggression issues, Mukatada, who becomes Craig's roommate and mostly refuses to leave his bed, Noelle, a beautiful girl Craig's own age, who has cuts on her face, and there are others that I'm not going to mention because they're all so unique and special that it's worth reading the book to find out. And then what were some of Craig's challenges? So disclaimer, you know this and you're not afraid going into this. But Craig faces various psychological problems, including depression, anxiety, difficulty sleeping, and difficulty eating. Most of the novel is taken up with his attempts to deal with these problems, although Craig faces challenges in navigating the world of 6 North, a psychiatric clinic. He also must face somewhat more typical high school problems, including insecurity about grades and girls and fitting in with the world. Very typical stuff for any teenager, but it's tough to read. But it's kind of a funny story. I hope you buy this book on my website because this was a fun read. I really could not put it down. But it's kind of a funny story. We're getting close to the end. So the next book I actually rented out to my grandma, and that's Circe. I saw somewhere that it's the perfect book to read during April. I don't have the book on me to show you, but I'm just going to go into it. Circe is a feminist retelling of the story of Circe, a witch in Greek mythology. She is the daughter of a nymph and Titan. She was born a disappointment to her family who believe her to be weak. Although she's ignored by the divine beings around her, she is fascinated by mortals and their world. And it's about time that I read this book because it's been popular for a while, but it did not disappoint. It was really good. Another book I could not put down or want to put down. I did not want to go to bed. I just wanted to keep reading to find out what happened, even though I was kind of aware of Circe a little bit. But it was really good. And it also helps me with the Professional Book Nerds Challenge. If you guys listen to that podcast, they do a reading challenge every year. And one of their challenges was to read a Greek retelling. So Circe was mine. So you can check it off your list if you buy this book on my website and you can read it yourself. And I loved it. I love Greek mythology. I know Greek mythology can be hard to read, but Circe wasn't, and it was more enjoyable too. And it was fascinating how connected she was not only to the Titans, but to other Olympians. I didn't know that about her, so I thought it was very interesting. And I didn't find her to be undesirable or disappointing like her parents thought she was or her siblings thought she was. She seemed very empathetic to others and helpful as she could be. And I really liked her character. I thought she was really kind as opposed to other Greek gods and goddesses. And it's kind of a disappointment how they truly are through the perspective of Circe. But let's get into the questions. How is solitude important to Circe's growth? Circe comes from a family and culture that is constantly controlling, demanding, and directing her. The only antidote to her may be solitude, a space away from the constant pressure to conform so she can discover who she wants to be. This type of separation may be vital for women in general. An essential theme to Homer's Odyssey is a longing for a nostos, or homecoming. In what way is that theme reflected in Circe's story? Homecoming is portrayed in the ways that Circe returns home, even if it is against her desire. She was requested to come home by her sister to help with her childbirth. Although she wasn't close to her sister, she had wanted Circe's magic to help her give birth to a minotaur, which is basically I don't know, like a magical bull. It sounds awful. Why would you do those things knowing that you had to give birth to that? It's just psycho. Anyway, so Circe's sister was just using her for her power, and this visit tainted Circe's perspective of homecoming. Another instance is when Circe went out to sea after her exile ended. She destroyed Scylla and came back to her island, which was a homecoming for her. But it was different this time because she had left Penelope there. You'll learn more about her from the book. Upon returning, she saw how different Penelope was. Penelope appeared more comfortable, at peace, and she tried magic despite not having enough will and wisdom to become a witch. But upon leaving, Circe was the witch of Agaia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. She leaves and comes back not being the witch of Agaia anymore. So I think her view of homecoming is tainted as opposed to how others, like us humans, would. Like it's a homecoming game or homecoming at our college or high school or something. So Circe's homecoming is nothing like ours. In the last question, Circe begins the novel feeling very close to her baby brother Aedes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these words, so don't bash me. Greek is very hard to read and learn. But anyway, why do their paths diverge so wildly? Why do you think he makes the choices he makes? And I think Aedes changed his path because he saw how Circe separated herself from others, how she isolated herself, and he didn't like how alone and scorned she was, and instead of protecting her, he wanted to grow away from that. He wanted to avoid that path and avoid that same fate. So he changed his by looking for a mate, someone who would make a good baby mama. And I say that lightly. And he embraced his potential and power and sought it out, as opposed to Circe, because Circe just kind of did what she could and went with the flow of things. But there's definitely a lot of feminist themes in here, definitely a lot of power and finding belonging and being a good person in general, not a good god or goddess or witch or whatever, but there is some of that, like how discriminating that is, just because someone's different. But it's a very, very good book. I highly recommend it. That is a 5 out of 5 for me. But we're going to go into our last book, which is Midwives by Crispo Jallian. Here it is. And let me see. Oh, that's. But I'll just read the back for you. On an icy winter night in an isolated house in rural Vermont, a seasoned midwife named Sybil Danforth takes desperate measures to save a baby's life. She performs an emergency C-section on a mother she believes has died of stroke. But what if, as Sybil's assistant later charges, the patient wasn't really dead? The ensuing trial bears the earmarks of a witch hunt, forcing Sybil to face the antagonism of the law, the hostility of traditional doctors, and the accusations of her own conscience. Exploring the complex and emotional decisions surrounding childbirth, Midwives engages, moves, and transfixes us as only the very best novels ever do. And I'm trying to find this for you because I did type up this script, but it's just not coming up. So we might just skip this for now. I thought I sent it to myself because I don't want to waste your precious time and get on with your rest of your day. But I like this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5. It is a legal story, medical novel. Very good. However, the narrator is the daughter of the midwife. I did not find her perspective very relatable. I thought she was very unattached to the story. There were parts where she was emotional and was upset, understandably so, because it's her mother being charged for murder, or manslaughter, really. So she got emotional at times, but I just didn't think she was that emotionally appropriate at times. And it was kind of dry on her end. I expected more from her. I'm not going to go into questions because I don't have my script, but I did like this book 4 out of 5, and this book is also on my website. That is all the books for April. I highly encourage you to check them out on my website. Like I said, there's an affiliate link. I get a portion of your commission at no extra cost to you, and that is on lexiesbooknook.com, spelled Lexies, booknook.com. Again, listen to my podcast on Spotify for free if you'd like. If you want to support the podcast, I have a Patreon account for $3 a month to see my face, the book titles, my book nook, and to get inspiration for your own. And if you want to keep in tune with me on YouTube, I also have that platform as well. On YouTube, you get bonus episodes of extra books on my TBR list. I have not posted any for April. I will probably post them in May when I have more free time and I'm back from my trip. But I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you keep listening, and I hope you keep on reading.